there's a couple of points that we didn't have time to make during Thomas's segment, but are very important. And it was regarding the reaction to his article about JD Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference. And Thomas's criticisms, I think, were spot on. And I was surprised to see JD Vance, Vice President of the United States, weigh in the comment threads. I mean, really surprising. And he also weighed in with Neil Ferguson, who is with the Hoover Institution, and also who is with the Viktor Pinchuk think tank in Ukraine before the war started. So Neil Ferguson's got a little conflict of interest there. But nonetheless, he is a arch globalist, more on the kind of neoconservative side. And JD Vance kind of, will put this up on screen here. He did a quote tweet about one of the comments Niall Ferguson made on the Ukraine war. And, you know, I'm impressed by Vance's intellectual capability to actually learn and comprehend things, which, let's face it, it's very rare for politicians these days to be able to do that. So he does have this ability, and he does have a lot of the makings of a formidable intellectual politician, possibly a good president one day. It's too early to tell. We'll see how he performs. We'll see how the Trump administration performs in the next 2 or 3 years before the next election cycle begins. But a couple of points I would hit home if we had more time, would have brought this up with Thomas Fassi. But one of the criticisms I had about Vance's speech is, and not just to JD Vance, but to all the European leaders too. Anybody who's railing about the immigration issue, you hear this, oh, the immigration issue. We must do something about the immigration issue. It's a threat to European civilization, and it's changing the ethno-demographic character of our countries. It's transforming our culture. I've said this before. If you watch or listen to our program over the years, no surprise what I'm about to say, but I'll say it again. There's always been immigration. It's one of the interesting attributes of the planet Earth. Throughout history, the history of humanity, there has always been immigration, and often mass immigration. And this has created societies, states, countries, civilizations, regions, city-states, okay, all of the above. So it's really inescapable, okay? Unless you want to throw up walls all over the world, it's just a fact of life, okay? So the question then is how much? And the question is how much and in what period of time? Because this is what causes the political instability. It's the amount of immigration in a short space of time. And it should also be remarked, and we also should discuss why there is immigration. And of course, this is an unpopular topic. Why? Because it tracks back to government. Government, if you haven't noticed yet, would rather have us fighting amongst ourselves, black, white, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, atheist, Christian, brown, white, brown, black, etc., etc. They would, Chinese, white American, you name it. Okay, they love seeing us fight each other, tearing each other to pieces. Because if we're fighting each other, we're not looking at them. And they are the cause of the economic disparity. Government is the cause of all of these things. Government is the cause of the immigration issue. Okay? The Afghani family that showed up in your village and is staying at a hotel paid for by the government, you can't blame them for wanting to escape the hellhole from which they came. If you don't like it, it's a question of policy. It's a question of the government. And most likely it's the one that you voted for, more than likely. More often than not, it's the one that you voted for. In the UK, the Tory government have presided over this migrant crisis and the last 3 waves of the migrant crisis. But yet the people who are most vocal about the issue, who are the most upset about the issue in the UK, are people who voted Tory, who voted for Boris Johnson, who voted for Brexit. And it seems like, well, looking by the numbers, it's not so clear, but by the media coverage, the anti-immigration media coverage has gone up by leaps and bounds after Brexit. So help me square this circle. It just doesn't make sense, does it? But back to JD Vance, back to the German leadership, back to the French leadership. Let's just call these NATO member states: France, Germany, Netherlands, Great Britain, and etc. Sweden, we'll throw them in there because they're in NATO now. Denmark, Poland, okay? All of these countries, but especially the ones I mentioned previously: Spain, Italy, okay? All NATO member states. So if you don't like the immigration, the intense migrant flows, what are the three biggest migrant flows in the last, I don't know, let's just say 20 years or so? Well, let's look at that. Iraq, coming from the Middle East, post-Iraq, coming from the post-Afghanistan invasion and occupation during that time. Okay, that's right the way through the 2000s and the 2010s and into the 2020s. Central Europe has been hit by a migrant crisis from Syria, from the Middle East, sub-Saharan Africa. So wait a minute. NATO actions in Afghanistan, U.S. NATO actions in Iraq. Okay, that covers the Middle East and Central Asia. Okay, Syria, that's a NATO-backed dirty war lasting over a decade. There's NATO there. Turkey's a NATO member. Turkey was instrumental in the destabilization of Syria. Yes, they facilitated most of it. And all the other NATO member states worked through Turkey. Okay, interesting that. And what about Libya? Well, that's a really important one because there used to be a country there called Libya. It's gone now. It's there's three different sort of statelets, dysfunctional, and all the migrant flows through Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa, from Sudan, from all these countries flowing up through Libya. And isn't it funny that Muammar Gaddafi, the president, the leader of Libya, who warned the West, he said, if you topple me, if you take our country down, we are the last backstop against the migrant crisis hitting Europe. We're keeping them in Africa. But you get rid of me and anything can happen. And sure enough, that's what happened. NATO took out an unprovoked war of aggression by NATO, took out Muammar Gaddafi, and we've had unfettered migration flows from Africa through Libya and through this region, this corridor. So those are all NATO actions. So, and this is to JD Vance and everybody else who is lecturing us on immigration. Is there not a correlation between foreign policy of NATO member states and immigration flows? Because I think there is, especially in Europe. I think there is. I think there's more than a correlation. I think there's causation. So why doesn't this topic ever come up for discussion at the Munich Security Conference? Why? Why don't they ever bring this up? It's one thing to complain about immigration. It's another thing to talk about what caused it. Why? Why not talk about it? Maybe because it's bad for business. Maybe because it's bad for the defense contractor business, the lucrative military industrial complex that works through NATO. That's interesting, isn't it? It's bad for business if we talk about this, because if there's no NATO actions in those places, well, there's no migrant crisis. But there's also a higher chance there's going to be less business for the military industrial complex, the defense giants in America and in Europe. Defense stocks in Europe are surging. Incredible, especially with even talk of Trump pulling out of Ukraine. All of a sudden, European defense stocks are surging. This is the market, folks. It's a dirty business. This is the protection racket that these countries and their corporate arms run. Isn't it interesting? So if we just had different foreign policy, or if we didn't have NATO, we wouldn't have the migrant crisis. Rather than bombing Libya to the Stone Ages and decapitating the leadership, carving it up into dysfunctional statelets, why not help to build up Libya so it is successful, so it can provide more for its population, so it can do more to police its borders and help to control the migrant flows. And by making Libya successful, Muammar Gaddafi was then making Africa successful. And if Africa is successful, less people will want to escape the economic deprivation in those countries. So you see, it's like a vicious cycle that we've created with our foreign policy led by the United States, seconded by the UK, and then the other NATO member states, the minion states, okay, the junior partners along for the ride. And then they'll kick up and complain, people or the AFD, whatever right-wing parties will kick up and complain about immigration. But it's very rare you'll hear any of these right-wing parties complain about the causes of the immigration, i.e. NATO and NATO's actions and U.S. actions in the Middle East, in North Africa and Central Asia and Ukraine. What about those refugees? Well, they don't complain as much about those because they're of a lighter skin tone, obviously. And we've all been told we need to get on side with this effort to defend Ukraine against Russia. So everybody's on message. The propaganda is working for Ukraine. No such campaigns, though, for anybody else who is a victim of an undeclared war of aggression at the hands of, wait for it, NATO. So it's not rocket science, folks. And so we're just kind of pointing out the obvious. And there's one more thing. And mind you, I like JD Vance. He has great potential. He has a great mind. He has a capacity to learn and to understand geopolitics and to understand what other countries' sensitive needs are, okay? However, there's one thing he didn't mention in his speech, which is this. That's the Nord Stream pipeline. So tell me how you can sit in Germany at the Munich Security Conference and berate European countries and leaders and not mention this, okay? Not mention this, the biggest attack on European infrastructure ever in history, energy infrastructure. Well, there was one which we did cover on the program on the Midweek Wire a week and a half ago with Freddie Ponton and Mats Nilsson, and that is the Yamal pipeline sabotage. That was in 1982, comparable to the Nord Stream, but the scale and size, that was done through a computer hack in 82, much like the Stuxnet virus. This is the Yamal disaster in 82. We'll put that up on screen real quick here. Fascinating story, but Nord Stream was something different. Looking at Nord Stream here, looking at this map, the amount of countries that were involved in this, we believe during the Baltops 22 NATO drill, which is where the explosives were prepped and then were detonated later during Northern Coast's drill in September of 2022. And the rest is history, but nobody wants to fess up to it. So how many countries were involved in that NATO drill? Well, all of the NATO members. That was in the summer of 2022, Baltops 2022. So they're all involved, and because they're all involved, everybody's keeping their mouth shut. That's kind of how it works. But this was absolutely, if you believe Seymour Hersh, award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, if you believe the general gist of his story, the general gist, you'll know this was a U.S.-led operation. But they weren't alone. There were other NATO member states involved, okay? The U.S.-led operation, most certainly, that many of them, at the very least, have knowledge of everything about it, and I include Denmark and Sweden in that category, Norway, I would say Germany as well, and probably Poland. And that's not to say the British are not involved. I would expect them to be. I'd be shocked if they weren't, especially with that text message to Liz Truss saying it's done. Okay, so the short-lived prime minister, I personally believe that's why she was shuffled out of Downing Street. It wasn't because of the economy. So that's history, folks. That's kind of how things are going to be remembered. So JD Vance, vice president, no mention of the Nord Stream pipeline. That has done tremendous damage to the European economy. Taking that offline, all of a sudden making them dependent on, wait a minute, hold on, United States supplied liquefied natural gas. So the Nord Stream sabotage bailed out the U.S. fracking industry, bailed out the U.S. LNG industry. And U.S. became the top supplier of gas at a higher premium, of course. It's more expensive to ship it across the Atlantic than it is to get cheap, reliable, affordable Russian gas via the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. So what happened? Well, German businesses left. German industry left Germany. Some of it left to the United States. So who benefited? As they say in Latin, qui bono. Qui bono, who benefited from the Nord Stream sabotage? The United States of America materially benefited. Not just benefited, made out like bandits. Yeah, they did. It's beyond debate. So I would go to Europe if it was me, if I was speaking, if I was representing the United States, I would go there with a little more humility. And I would say, oh, and by the way, the Nord Stream sabotage. We regret this is one of the big failures of the Biden administration. And we are going to launch an inquiry and investigation to find out what actually happened. And we will make amends. We will pay reparations. When we find out, we can absolutely confirm who is responsible. Of course, they already know who's responsible. The U.S. Pentagon knows. This was all done via the White House, Joe Biden's White House, but the knowledge, the personnel, the records are there. Okay, but at least give it lip service. If you want to lay it at the feet of the Biden, a senile Joe Biden, go right ahead. If that's what you want to do, and it wouldn't be 100% wrong, to be quite honest. It wouldn't be. Most likely, this was a crazy plan hatched by Joe Biden's bloated National Security Council, led by some of the most incompetent individuals ever to sit in those positions. Okay, and it was just rubber stamped by a senile geriatric pseudo president. So I think you already got a get out of jail free card. But what you do have is a loss of faith in America, but that can be repaired. There's one thing, however, with the Nord Stream pipeline, and especially when you consider, here we go back up on screen, how many people were involved in this, how many NATO members were involved with this. If revelations are ever to happen as to what really went down, how the operation really happened, which will release some of that information this week on 21st Century Wire. Got a report coming out this week that will answer one aspect of this, not the whole story, of course, but one very key and important detail. But my point is, when the truth is known, what this will do to the reputation of NATO as an organization is curtains. It's toast. It's over. The damage Nord Stream revelations will do to NATO as an organization, its legitimacy, its mandate, the ability for members to cooperate and trust the hierarchy of leadership in this organization. No, you'll never overcome the damage that has been done. It is one of the biggest missteps, geopolitical, foreign policy missteps in the history of the modern nation state. And if it's a U.S.-led operation, the U.S. has to own it. Doesn't matter if it's the Trump administration, the Biden administration, or whoever, or the next administration, a Vance administration, whatever. Doesn't matter. You got to own it. Uncle Sam has to own it. It's got to take responsibility for what happened, and all the other states that were involved in the cover-up, like Sweden and Denmark and Germany, and any other states like Great Britain or the Netherlands or Norway that were also directly involved in the sabotage operation during Baltops and afterwards, or had knowledge of it, they're culpable as well. And they should be liable for damages. How that's paid or compensated, and to who, I think the people of Europe deserve a stimulus check. I think Russia deserves compensation. All the parties who can claim damages for what happened, they all have a claim. That's how it should go down. That's how it should go down. But will it happen that way? I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we'll see that during this Trump term. I think it would be great. It would definitely be a breath of fresh air and definitely set the world on the right track. But I don't know if we're going to see it. What's worse, though, is if it gets exposed and then they have to deny it and cover it up. So again, back to you, White House. What are you going to do about the Nord Stream sabotage? Because you better do something. Because Uncle Sam's got his fingerprints all over it. That is for certain. And if you don't think so, you're deluding yourself. And you might be able to cover your eyes and ears and say hum, hum, ho, hum for the next 3 years and kick the can down the road for the next administration. But the problem will never go away. And this will eat at the legitimacy and the foundations of NATO. So it's better to nip it in the bud now. But I'm not sure if that's going to happen. Not sure if they're ready for that to happen.